what she does and the things that she does, how does that relate to applied linguistics? Very, very simple thing. Let us listen to her. And just another sentence about her is she is doing her PhD in linguistics, in particular phonology, at University of California, Berkeley.
So the first thing I want to say is that I'm from Southern California and I'm about to talk about my favorite thing, which means that I might get excited and talk very fast. So if that happens and you can't understand me, please say something. Also, you know, of course I haven't been here for very long, so I don't know if I'm about to mention something that doesn't make any sense to you. So if you have any questions at all about anything, please just stop me in the middle, and that's absolutely fine. Okay, so I focus on mainly on phonetics and phonology. So I'm interested in what the mechanism behind which people are able to produce speech, and when they're listening to other people, how they can perceive it. One of the an important way in which this is related to applied linguistics is something that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, which is trying to learn a second language and how insanely difficult that is. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about acoustics and the speech waveform, and then I'm going to get into the kinds of information that are in the waveform that your brain cares about and how the language you grew up with can shape that. Right, so this is something like what speech looks like, right? So this is time, and this is amplitude, which is something like loudness. It's not exactly loudness, but it's close enough. So this signal actually contains a lot of information, more than you probably hear and use all of that information, but you don't use all of that for the objective of understanding the actual words that you're hearing, right? So if we were to just look at a brief moment in time, a very, very short window, say like right here, like literally just this point in time, and we would see that this waveform is actually made up of multiple different frequencies. So is this stuff that have you guys talked about formants already? No, formants? Okay, let me back up a little bit then, just a little bit. So, right. Have you seen one of these diagrams before? Okay, all right, great. Okay, so, okay, right. Okay, so someone talks, right? This is a abstractified glottis. So here's your glottis, right? It's somewhere around here, and it's doing this while you're talking, right? So each of those pulses, the glottis is vibrating, and it has its own frequency, which you can control, right? Because you can control the pitch of your voice. But suppose it just sort of looks something like this. And then this passes through the vocal tract, and you are changing the shape of your vocal tract every time you move your tongue or your lips. And that's acting as what's called a filter. So that's emphasizing some frequencies and downplaying other frequencies. So this sort of turns into something, more like that or whatever, okay? So that's your speech signal, and it is made up of multiple frequencies. Okay, so now coming back over here. If you were to look at a single moment in time, you could look at the different frequencies that make up that single moment. So here we're looking at time and amplitude. We're going to change the axes a little bit just to look at that moment. So Okay, so this is the y-axis is still amplitude, but now we're going to look at frequency. So, so remember the very even signal turning into that other signal? So that's exactly what we're going to, that other signal is what we're going to see here. So you'll see something like, okay. So what we're seeing here is that some of the frequencies come out at a much higher amplitude than the other ones, and that is a direct result of the filter. We call these emphasized or these sort of emboldened frequencies formants. So this would be our first formant, our lowest. And importantly, these emphasized formants are resonant frequencies of the vocal tract, meaning if you were to take the vocal tract and like hit it with a spoon, it would vibrate at those frequencies. So you know, like hitting a glass and it goes wah 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 wah, right? So it's like that. So here's your, and we abbreviate formants with a capital F. So here's F1, here's F2, and here's F3. These three lowest frequencies are pretty much the most important frequencies that you need for being able to distinguish the different sounds of speech. So within a given language, the sounds that you recognize as being different from each other, we're going to call phonemes. So F1, F2, and F3 are generally the most important bits of information. What's cool is that different languages put sort of care about different types of information more than other languages. And this is getting into the part that where we can see how putting emphasis on different kinds of information makes it difficult to learn a new language. So, so take for example this very famous case of Japanese. Do you know what two sounds are very difficult for Japanese speakers to be able to distinguish between? Yes? Yes, okay. So here's the thing. In Japanese doesn't make a distinction between L and R. L and R are mainly distinguished acoustically by this parameter, by F3. So this means that Japanese speakers grow up and they use these two lower frequencies to distinguish between sounds all the time. So for example, E, the vowels E and U are distinguished mainly by F2. The vowels A and E are distinguished mainly by F1. F3 helps in making some of these distinctions, but it's not crucial. Therefore, even though Japanese speakers hear the exact same signal, their brains are just not using all the information that's present there to make distinct categories. So they have, if you imagine the head of a speaker, they just have sort of one box, and that's sort of their RL box, and everything just sort of goes in there. And it's like, oh yeah, I heard this thing, and it sounds like this category I produced, this sort of a thing, right? And that's what it ends up sounding like. Similarly, when I tried very hard to learn Hindi and Tamil, I had to suddenly change all of my, or start hearing a difference between da and the, right? Which for you is like, you know, Sarah, why is that difficult? Because this is something I do every day. So all of a sudden I'm hearing two different things, and but what's different is, so this is your da and this is your the, but American English uses actually something more like that's halfway in between, right? So if you were to make a continuum from different parts of the mouth, this more or less is your the, right? That's American English. And this is your the. So I'm hearing two things that are both different from each other, and they're also both different from something that I produce, but my brain says, well, I know one thing that involves a tongue tip getting somewhere near somewhat the teeth, and so I'm going to classify all those things as the same thing. And trying to actively fight against that is what makes learning is one thing that makes learning a new language very difficult. Now, as a linguist, of course, and especially as a phonetician, I can produce the, and I think I do okay. And I can produce the, and I think I do okay. But being able to produce something doesn't necessarily mean that you can hear it too, right? Because I can feel that my tongue is in the right place, or probably the right place. But I can't actually, I think I probably get it right about 50% of the time, and that's after like 5 years of effort. So that can make learning a new language incredibly difficult. Any questions so far? Okay. So that's one problem of trying to map your one category onto two separate categories, right? But the same thing, it works the same way in reverse as well. So this is the problem of, okay, so you can understand really well, but trying to sound like a native speaker of a language that you're trying to speak can also be quite difficult. So, and this is what gets into which information do you actually care about. Have you talked about stops versus fricatives? Yeah, okay. So what are the two cues that you have that you get from a stop that can tell you information about what stop that is? So okay, so for example, you have a sequence where it's a vowel and then a stop, which you're just going to represent as a capital T, and then another vowel, right? So you have vowels on either side of the stop. So you get information about what the stop is in here and in here, right? Because if we actually look at a waveform, it would look something. Oh, okay. And then, right? So in here we have silence, and during the silence you get silence or some voicing. So you don't get you get information about whether a stop is voiced or voiceless, but you don't get information about where in the mouth that it was made. But you get some information right here. Do you know what part of the stop that's called? So this is the closure, and then this is sort of like a very, very short, high amplitude thing. That's the burst. So this is during a stop, right? You have made some kind of closure. So in the case of duh, that's the tongue hitting the alveolar ridge, and it's staying there for some period of time. And during that time, all this air is flowing through here and getting stuck behind the tongue, and it's building up pressure. And then once the tongue releases, that's exactly what we get. It's called the release of the stop. And so you get a little tiny opening here, and all this air rushing out. And so it's like a 5 to 10 millisecond period of time, but you actually get a ton of information. Your brain can process that information and tell you where the stop was made. So that's one place where you get information. You also get information on either side of the stop from the neighboring vowel. So I can say what and not actually release the T at the end, but you know that it was a T coming up because you could hear it at the end of the right? Okay. So the information that we get coming out of this vowel and coming into this vowel are called the formant transitions. So these are our formants, right? We hear them during sounds like vowels or R and L, but of course you can't hear them during silence because it's silence. But they change over time as you're going between different speech segments, and so you can hear those transitions, and that will give you some information about the stop. So where I'm getting at is you have two different types of information that are very different from each other. You have this burst, and you also have these formant transitions. And the question is, do you listen for both of them, both of those types of information, when you're deciding what kind of stop you heard? So suppose you are a Hindi or Tamil speaker, or actually most South Asian languages speaker, if not all, many, okay? And you have two categories, right? You have your duh box, and you have your the box, and you hear, this is American, you hear some Californian saying, duh, where are you going to put that? Do you know what you make when you make it, when you're speaking English?
It does seem obvious that we put them in between those, but before that, if I had not utilized that knowledge, I wouldn't have known that.
Okay, so when you speaking, yeah.
Maybe because we also watch a lot of TV series, so that's why we are getting used to it.
Sure. So maybe you're used to hearing it, and you're able to understand that it is in fact that it is a D. But when you speak English, what do you know what you're actually producing? What you're producing in a word like dog? Yeah, you're producing a retroflex. The reason why this is curious is that to me, I actually think that my duh sounds more like a dental duh than like a retroflex duh. But speakers of South Asian languages hear this American duh and they think, oh, this sounds much more like my retroflex, and so when you go to produce it, and you're much more likely to produce something that you already produce if it otherwise doesn't really matter. I mean, like I can perfectly understand when someone uses a retroflex and not an American just plain alveolar stop. So you pick the thing that feels closer, right? Now this is interesting because it shows us that you're actually caring about one type of information over another type. So remember that F3 cue that we were talking about? So the same F3 cue that lets us know that an R is present also tells us when a retroflex is coming up, because as the tongue is curling back, and if you speak there we go. If you speak Tamil or if you speak Malayalam and you know this sound, this is the one that's transcribed as ZH a lot, but in IPA we know as, yeah, okay, right? Okay, so that's virtually the same sound as English right? So that same sound comes up when you're about to make a retroflex. So if you were to say something like, right? Yeah, something like that. If you say it really slowly, you'll probably hear your tongue curling back. And an American would hear that and say, oh, I hear an R there, and would probably transcribe that as. And so that's why to us, as Americans, we hear this retroflex and we say that does not sound like our duh, because we're used to, whenever we hear that kind of cue, we're used to attributing that to some kind of R. Whereas when a Hindi or a Tamil speaker is speaking, they are used to hearing that cue and attributing it to the stop instead. Does that make sense? Okay. That was most of what I wanted to say on this topic. And so I wanted to open it up to questions about this or really about anything sort of phonetic or phonological. But this is sort of to give you an idea of how the speech signal is rich with information, and depending on the language that you grew up speaking, you may care in the non-conscious, not in the sort of subconscious sense, may care about some information over other types of information, and how that might make it difficult to either learn a new language or to sound like a native speaker of that language.
I just had a question. Yeah, so no, I think it's quite stupid, but you know, like the word Tamil, for instance.
Yeah.
I think Tamil speakers say Tamil, but I've heard like it pronounced in English as Tamil.
Yes.
But it's not like English speakers can't say Ta because they have thought, so they can say Tamil, but they always say Tamil. So I'm concerned about the first letter T.
Oh.
Okay. So why are they not saying Th and saying?
I would consider the last letter I mean, they have an R that is very similar to Ra, so why go for La?
Right.
Tamil.
Okay, these are both great questions. So they're getting into slightly different things. All right. To answer the question about why versus ul, part of it is that when the British came, I think this is just my guess. But the British came and they were like, oh, that's some sound I can't deal with. I'm just gonna pick something close in my language. And the British don't have R's at the end of words, or sorry, in the final position of a syllable. So that would be my guess as to how L became conventionalized in English. That's one way. Another way is that not all Tamil speakers have that sound. Many, and as you probably know, some have more like a la, and some have a flat out like la. So say palam instead of param. And so I don't know when that started to happen, because I believe I don't know how old that sound change is. But that could also be another reason why there's an L in English. Whoever was sort of talking when someone said, "Hey there, what language do you speak here?" So that's one possibility. Another is that so this is actually also getting into that F3 problem, except that it's actually fairly complicated. I think it might be complicated, and it's a question that I've also been asking, and may have to do with F3. And so the distinction between L and R in terms of F3 is that L tends to have a higher F3 and R has a very low F3. And this is specifically the type of R. This is not the R type of R. That's something entirely different. And so I don't know if the way that the Tamil speakers who don't have the sound, if they weight this cue differently, perhaps. So that's sort of still an open question. Now to deal with the question, so you're saying how come English speakers say Tamil and not Tamil? Because, so we don't, American or British, no English speakers have a distinction between the and the, right? So this is getting at this is getting at a distinction between what's called free variation and phonemic contrast. So free variation means that you can pronounce a certain sound, for example, in a variety of ways. Because as we know, speech, you don't say every sound exactly the same way every single time you speak, right? There's tons of variation, and that's partly what your brain is trying to deal with when you hear a new sound and you say, okay, well, I know that I'm expecting there to be variation, so which of the things that I already know, which of my categories does this variant belong to? Right, so there's variation, and in English, because we don't have if you said to an English speaker like, hang on, let me think of an example. Like dog versus dog, it wouldn't matter. For us, that's all, oh, that's a tongue tippy sound hitting an alveolar ridgy type of sound. And so that just sort of gets classified as a duh. If you say the duh, you say, oh yes, it's definitely a foreign D, but it's still a D. So it's not about an inability to make the sound, it's about what your language does. In the same way that in syntax, like in the examples that we were seeing earlier, it's not that, it's the way that your language just sort of works. It's just a part of the language. So in English, the and the and duh all get classified as a D. And so the English speakers are not used to making different types of D in different situations because it doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't matter for English. So that's probably why they don't say something like Tamil. When I say to myself, I'm going to make a tongue tippy sound that is going to be somewhere close to the alveolar ridge, I say Tamil. But because I'm a phonetician, I know I can say Tamil, right? Yeah. Does that answer that? Yeah. Okay. Yes.
So we were talking about
Japanese and L and R, right?
Yes.
So does the reason, I always thought that L did not exist within the Japanese vocabulary or the alphabet before the Anglicization.
Right.
So is that why they are like, of course it happened, like L came in with the Americans, but they only included it after that, right? So is it because of that they are unable to distinguish between the L and the R?
So we need to be careful because the alphabet can be very deceiving, right? So for example, we write Did I do that right? We write this, but we can get either an L or a retroflex L or a retroflex approximant, despite the fact that this is written, right? So I don't know I don't know enough about the way Japanese writes loan words, but they may write an L for certain types of loan words, but they probably won't pronounce it. So it's not actually part of the phonology of the language per se. So if it's not part of the language, if it doesn't have what's called a high functional load, in fact, it doesn't have any functional load, meaning it doesn't matter. This Q doesn't matter in the language at all, like to distinguish between L and R in native Japanese words. Therefore, they don't have experience with having these two separate categories, and therefore they end up not being able to distinguish generally.
Do you think that will, like, despite the fact that they've had it as part of their vocabulary for say 60, 70 years and have not been able to incorporate it into proper speech as such, do you think it will come? It's a generational thing that will come with the generations, like say 10 more.
Maybe. So there are a couple factors at play here. First of all, you're getting at something important, which is the role of experience in speech, and experience is very important for exactly. So like experience. So what you have what you're exposed to when you're acquiring speech will definitely have an effect on what sorts of distinctions you can perceive. And then, of course, at what age they learn, children are learning English, if they are. And seeing as we've been imposing it on everybody, it's probably going to be earlier and earlier. But I don't think that when you grow up learning a certain language, right, you end up attuning your senses to generally only the distinctions that you really need to make, right? So kind of what I was saying earlier about I hear someone say dog, I can hear that, I automatically classify that as the word dog, but I can hear that there's something different about it, right? So it's like it's possible that they would hear an L and say, oh, that's a slightly different type of R. Maybe. I mean, people are also very different in their perceptual sensitivities. But I don't think, if you grow up speaking Japanese and not making a distinction between L and R, it's very unlikely. So when the words get borrowed in, they are perhaps spelled with an L, but I can almost guarantee you that they are not actually pronounced that way. So I don't think any more time would actually change much in their perceptual categories, unless they're actually increasing their exposure to these two different categories.
Grows up listening both Tamil and English.
Yeah.
All these sounds, for you, will the sounds get mixed up with the
No, actually, research seems to indicate that people actually often separate their categories really well. What's interesting though is that there's a really neat study. It's called I think it's 1997. Yeah. And it's just a single subject, so I mean, take from that what you will. But it's about I think Brazilian Portuguese and American English bilingual, and it's about her stop categories. Long story short, English makes a distinction between ka and ga, and Portuguese makes a distinction between ga and ga. Those are hard for me. And when she would spend a few months in each country, and when she spent more time in one country, her stops would sort of drift towards one and then drift back. But that also gets into a whole nother line of research about what's called accommodation, which is sounding more or less like the people you're talking to. And it could have been, accommodation can vary between people for all sorts of reasons. Yeah.
So going back to the Tamil thing, I noticed that a lot of Tamilians themselves would say Tamil or Tamilian with a the, but when we say a word like tamgram, which might be something that's come from English, in a slang English way, even the Tamilians themselves say tam, you say tam. Right?
Yeah, but that's because we say it because it's coming from English. We don't say, if I talk to somebody, I don't say tamra, because they won't know it. So we don't even use that vocabulary.
Is it a sort of compartmentalization, like relating to what you were saying earlier, like separating it out?
Sort of. So it's like, kind of, yeah. So if you hear a word coming from English and you hear it from an English speaker, and there probably is also some knowledge of it, there's some kind of knowledge, like knowing this is coming from English. You know that you use a retroflex for all of these, what are called coronal sounds that use the tongue tip. All of these coronal sounds, you use they're coming from English, you use a retroflex. And so some of that knowledge plus just hearing an English speaker say it and categorizing that as a retroflex.
So that, again, in connection with Gopika's question when she says how English people know the but still say the, is because you've probably not heard Tamil being called Tamil by like native speakers. If you just read it, it's Tamil.
So the thing is, the point is that
would be a TH.
is that English speakers don't actually, they don't really know the difference between the and the, right? They don't, so they may hear something is different, but they don't know how to attribute that difference to anything articulatory.